Hi everyone, and welcome to my second supplemental video for my Info 287, the Hyperlinked Library blog. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my background with participatory culture and Web 2.0 technology, especially with the importance of libraries kind of adopting this Web 2.0 way of thinking. And one of our foundational readings this week talked about that, and it was called Library 2.0, A Guide to Participatory Library Service. And I think it's really important that we that you kind of understand where I'm coming from, because I think there's a lot of good background reading available to us, and it's some of the work that I came across while I was doing my communication studies degree, and I was introduced to the writings of some really important Web 2.0 advocates, and some of these people included Lawrence Lessig, who wrote the book Code version 2.0, right here. I've read some work by Tim O'Reilly, and another one of great importance that I think is called We the Media, Grassroots Journalism for the People, by the People. And this was written by Dan Gilmore. Now, Dan Gilmore wrote this book in 2006, and We the Media really discusses the idea of this grassroots movement, where it's taking a traditional media such as in Dan Gilmore's case, because he's a professional journalist, looking at journalism and taking that, which is traditionally seen as a top-down approach, so people writing from the top down to the people, and there wasn't much of a bottom-up approach. But what blogs and Web 2.0 has really allowed us to do is really come from the bottom up, in a sense that people were now content creators, not just content producers. And I think that's really important. And the fact that Dan Gilmore is actually a professional journalist by trade, and he's arguing that user-generated content wouldn't necessarily replace traditional media, and instead it actually really supplements them, I think is a really important step forward. And it's a really interesting way to see it, because we keep hearing how, Web 2.0 is really destroying some of these traditional news outlets, things like newspapers, like things like traditional media that's on the news, on TV, things like that. I think it's really important to see someone in the field talking about how these technologies are actually supplementing traditional media. Now, it's important to note also that not all the literature written about Web 2.0 really does support Web 2.0's user-generated content. And in fact, one of the most influential writing for me, and really set me on the path to advocating Web 2.0 and participatory culture, was a work written by Andrew Keen in 2007. And it's actually this book right here. It's called The Cult of the Amateur: How Blogs, MySpace, YouTube, and the rest of today's user-generated media are destroying our economy, our culture, and our values. Let's take a breath, because that's a long title there. Now, what Andrew Keen says is that because there's so much content being produced online, that it's actually creating kind of like a noise. There's so much noise on the internet now, and there's so much music, videos, and news articles being written by people that aren't actually trained to do so, that are being, written and consumed by people. And he's worried that this, Web 2.0 is creating a group of people that don't fact check, things like that. And I think that's a really negative way to look at it. And I think it's a bold statement, but I think this represents an old way of thinking. And Keen thinks that information should essentially be controlled by gatekeepers. And he actually writes, I think at one point he mentions librarians, that we need to be the gatekeepers, and professionals need to control this information. Now, I don't really agree with this necessarily, but I think it's a kind of written testament to this idea of the ivory tower, this, that there's like this tower, and, we are academics and we have to live within this, idea, and we are the ones that have to protect this information. And I think that's a very traditional way of thinking in higher education. And higher education is something that I'm really interested in. But I don't necessarily agree with that. So what he says is that people are essentially creating too much bad content online. One thing that I do agree with Keen, though, is that we really do have to, with the amount of stuff being produced online right now, we do have to be critical thinkers. And this is something we should be doing regardless of whether it's where it's being produced. Whether it's in a book like this, I think we have to be critical of everything that we're reading. And I think that's something as librarians that we have to do, and especially in higher education. Preparing people, I say, instead of looking at a blog and saying, oh, this is just, it's a blog, so it's not necessarily a credible source, we have to look at who the author of the blog is, because there's plenty of blogs out there written by professionals. One, for example, is a gentleman by the name of Michael Geist, and he's a professor at the University of Ottawa, and he writes on copyright law in Canada. And he's someone I follow, and I actually, the content being produced online is actually very high quality content. So I think we just have to be aware of what we're reading, and that's, I think the Web 2.0 allows the turnaround time to be much quicker. Something that I find really disturbing in Keen's work is he brings up this idea of something called the infinite monkey theorem, and I'm actually going to read a little bit about the infinite monkey theorem from his book here. So Huxley's theory, this monkey theorem theory, Huxley's theory says that if you provide infinite monkeys with infinite typewriters, some monkey somewhere will eventually create a masterpiece. And then further on in the book, it says, just a few pages down, today's technology hooks up all those monkeys with all those typewriters, except in our Web 2.0 world, the typewriters aren't quite typewriters, but rather networked personal computers. And the monkeys aren't quite monkeys, but rather internet users. And instead of creating masterpieces, these millions and millions of exuberant monkeys, many with no talent in the creative arts than our primate cousins, are creating an endless digital forest of mediocrity. For today's amateur monkeys can use their network computers to publish everything from uninformed political commentary to unseemly home videos to embarrassingly amateurish music to unreadable poems, reviews, essays, and novels. So that's on page 2 and 3 of the book. So if you can get through, I would recommend, if anything, read the introduction to this book, because it's going to give you a really good idea of what to expect as you continue on through this book. But what the infinite monkey theorem says is that essentially, we're all monkeys, and we're writing there's so much of us writing for the web that it's just really, in my mind, it's kind of an insulting way to look at people, especially who are creating content. So in another piece of work that I read called Why Federated Search, which was written in Knowledge Quest, which is an online journal, they talk about someone named Judy Luther in response to a new search form, so like Federated Search. So like it or not, Google and its competitor search engines have created a model that librarians, as information professionals, must meet head-on. It's time for librarians to accept that library users are not interested in being more like us, and this is cited in this Why Federated Search article. And I think what Judy Luther is saying here is really important, because if we stop really looking at what our users want, then we are essentially letting them down, and we have to be willing to look at what the user wants. And I think a really good example of when a corporation doesn't look at a user is Blockbuster. People, and Blockbuster in a lot of ways are similar to what libraries are doing. We're loaning out material, and we have to be really aware of what our customers want. So I think that this quote here really sums it up for us. In another piece of writing called The Future of Learning, Institutions in a Digital Age, which was actually written by the MacArthur, it's this book here. It's the MacArthur Foundation. It's written there by Kathy N. Davidson and David Theo Goldberg. They talk about, learning institutions in a digital age. And what they say is that Ichabod Crane, from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, could come into today's classrooms and really know exactly how to teach the class. And I think that's really fascinating, because it shows how stagnant higher education is when trying to adopt new ways of learning. And I think that Web 2.0 really does offer us a real unique opportunity to seize and bring into the classroom. I think that we can do a lot of things with it. So in a sense, just to wrap up, what this book, The Cult of the Amateur, did for me was like the sports almanac for Biff Tannen in the movie Back to the Future. So if you really want to stop me from really being a big advocate of Web 2.0, you have to find me before I take this course in my communication studies and stop me from accessing some of the readings that I talked about here. Because I think that, becoming an advocate for Web 2.0 technology is really important for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a list of references to the works that I have mentioned here today in the blog post below the video, as well as in the description for the video. So if people stumble across this on YouTube, they can access some of those readings as well. So I'd just like to thank everyone this week for kind of bearing with my little rant here, and have a great week, and I look forward to more blog posts in the future. So thank you very much. Bye.